In this video, we're going to talk about audiobooks versus reading. Which is better? Reading an actual book or listening to an audiobook? And when I say better, I mean which is better for comprehension, because we all know that some people have a preference for one or the other, or which is better could be determined by the situation. Like if you're driving a car, it's obviously a better idea to listen to a book rather than reading a book while driving. But which is better for your overall learning? In this video, we're going to look at some of the research. So in one study done back in 2016, the research couldn't find much of a difference. This study had three groups. One group listened to sections of the nonfiction book. The other group read those sections of the same book. Though it should be noted, they were reading those same parts from an e-reader, not a physical book. And a third group, they did both. They read and listened at the same time. After they were done, everyone took a quiz to see how well they understood the information, and it turns out they found no significant difference between any of the groups. I'll add a link below to the study if you'd like to check out more detail about it. So based on that study, it seems like it's inconclusive, but keep in mind that study utilized e-readers, screen-based reading, and there is some evidence to suggest that reading on a screen reduces comprehension compared to reading on the printed page. Based on that, it might be possible that if the study had traditional books versus audiobooks, the old school traditional books might win. If you're wondering why paper-based books are better for comprehension than ebooks, some of it has to do with being able to tell where you are in the text. In a traditional book, if you're halfway through, it's much easier to tell where you are. That's harder to do when you're reading digitally. Now, I've used multiple e-reading devices ever since the first Kindle came out in 2007, and I realized that most of these devices will give you an idea of where you are in the text by showing you maybe a percentage or even a page number. But this is more abstract and less noticeable than a physical book. Think about it. If you're reading a story, it's very important to keep track of the sequence of events. So knowing where you are in the book helps build that story arc. And it helps if you understand the material, and it helps you to anticipate the ending. And because printed text is tied to a specific location on the page, people seem to remember it better than screen-based text. That's according to some research on that topic and its relation to spatial attributes of the printed text. Some of you may have noticed that when you've taken notes, you can sometimes later backtrack and find exactly where you took that note because you sort of remember where it was, either on the left side or the right side of the page, or if it was near the top or the bottom of the page. That's all related to spatial memory. And when we conduct our speed reading and memorization courses, there's one technique known as the memory palace, and it utilizes spatial memory by having you remember things in their location. So maybe the location of your home or somewhere else. That memory technique, sometimes known as the method of loci, was used by the ancient Greeks. So it's a few thousand years old, but gold. Now, when it comes to reading a book versus listening, there's a certain self-directed rhythm through which you absorb the information. When you're reading text, about 15% of your eye movements are regressive. That's where you read a little, maybe just a few words or a sentence, and then you quickly go back to reread from the beginning of the sentence. Sometimes you might not even notice it's happening, these regressive eye movements. Going back to reread can be a little annoying, and you can learn to improve your concentration so you don't reread as often, but going back to reread definitely improves your comprehension. Compare that to listening. Sure, all these audiobook and podcast programs allow you to rewind, but it takes a little more effort compared to rereading printed text. And there's another factor that plays a part when we're reading or listening, and that has to do with your mind wandering off. It can be a few seconds or even minutes where we just space out. Eventually we snap out of it and we backtrack. In printed text, it's easier to backtrack and find the place where you started zoning out. Also, with an actual book, the turning of a page gives you a slight break, and this can help you absorb and savor the information more effectively. Now, in another study in 2010, it showed that students that listened to a podcast of a certain lesson scored much worse on a comprehension test than those that read the exact same lesson on paper. the listeners scored on average 28% lower than readers, 28% lower. That's a difference between an A and a D. However, you do want to keep in mind that as humans, we learn to adapt. With practice, you can get better at absorbing information from audio. Same goes with screen-based reading. And there's actually some research indicating that people who practice screen-based learning actually get better at it. I'll post a link to the study and all the others that we mentioned below in the description. But keep in mind, audiobooks have some strengths that are, give them an advantage over printed text. Think about it. For tens of thousands of years, humans have been sharing information orally. Some of the oldest stories we know of started as oral traditions, before we had the written word. When you read, you're using a part of your brain that evolved for other purposes, not reading. It's just that we're sort of hacking that part of the brain to work for the task of reading. But if you compare readers to listeners, listeners can get information that readers can't, such as intonation or inflections of someone's voice. That's why it's easier for you to tell if someone's being sarcastic when you hear them. It's a lot harder to notice sarcasm while you're reading a text. The final factor I want to discuss is the issue of multitasking. When you're reading, you're just reading. That's one thing. But when you're listening to an audiobook, it's usually while you're doing something else, maybe driving, doing chores, exercising. If you're trying to multitask while learning, you are most certainly not going to absorb the information as well. I'm not saying you should ditch audiobooks. I love listening to audiobooks while walking or driving, but it might be better to listen to the leisure material and read the information that is more important for work or school in a physical book. That's if you're trying to maximize comprehension. Ultimately, the best answer for you is going to depend on your purpose. If you're reading for leisure, the difference between reading and listening might not be a big deal. In fact, I think you should utilize both because you'll end up getting more reading done in the end. But if your purpose is to work or study, you might find that reading leads to more comprehension because it's a more active process, because you can more easily take notes, underline, or highlight. You'll also have better spatial awareness to understand where you are in the material. And you'll usually have better concentration when you're reading because you're just focusing on one thing, reading. I hope you found this topic interesting. In the comments below, I'd love to hear your take on this. What do you prefer and why? And if you're struggling with any of the challenges we mentioned here, like paying attention or just reading in general, we have courses on our website related to speed reading, memory, and focus that can help you be more productive. Don't forget to subscribe below if you'd like updates on the weekly videos we're doing. I'm Paul Nowak. Thank you so much for watching and have a great rest of your day.